The doomsayers are added again at the Synod of Synodality. And of course, the doomsayers in this case are not the prophets of doom that Pope John the 23rd decried at the opening of the Second Vatican Council. These prophets of doom instead are the people who demand that the church change fundamental elements of the faith to align with secular values, secular norms, and secular demands. These demands being made by people who would never consider joining the Catholic faith at all. And I hate to say it because I don't think Schadenfreude is a good thing in general, but there is a bit of Schadenfreude watching them melt down when Francis won't let them go as far as they want him to go. And of course, we are unfortunately talking about the issue of deaconettes, as I call them, deaconesses, as they get more mainstream voices call them. And I call them deaconettes because what they're asking for has no history in the Catholic Church. It just does not. There has never been ordained deaconesses in the history of the Church. They claim there have been. They claim that holy orders is actually open to them, meaning they believe the magisterium of the Church has been wrong for like 2,000 years. Go figure. If they were to think about the arguments they're making, they might rein in the rhetoric a little bit. So let's get some context by starting here with this article from Crux Now, which always claims to be taking the Catholic pulse. And their headline is Vatican's doctrinal czar fires back at criticism over women deacons. The doctrinal czar is, of course, Cardinal Fernandez, who, to give you an idea how bad the situation is at the Synod, he's the voice of reason. Yes, the man writing that really bad poetry, bad on multiple levels, including moral levels, the man who wrote Fiducia Supplicans is the voice of reason in the room. That's not a good sign for the Synod. I kind of wonder if Francis has any buyer's remorse over the Synod. I don't know. Maybe this is exactly what he wanted. Who knows? We will all find out when we finally get his final document, probably next summer, on all of this. But here's a little bit of context before we go to what how the advocates are pushing back on this. So, quote, on the core issue of women deacons, Fernandez said the pontiff has made it clear the issue is, quote, not yet mature, but insisted that Francis is, quote, very concerned for the role of women in the church and has asked the dicastery for the faith to explore other possibilities that don't involve holy orders. Fernandez then asserted that a focus on the diaconate, quote, does not resolve the question of millions of women in the church. He said that there are concrete ways of empowering women that haven't been fully exploited. First, he pointed to the new ministry of catechist, created by Pope Francis in May 2021 and open to women. He said that one form of that ministry would be a catechist who actually leads a faith community in the absence of a priest, a role which implies real leadership and authority and which women can perform. Yet Fernandez said, quote, very few bishops' conferences have acted on the possibility, saying it hasn't, quote, been received. Second, he pointed to the ministry of acolyte, opened to women by Pope Francis in January 2021. In fact, it's been conceded only in a small percentage in the dioceses, and many times priests don't want to present women to the bishop for this ministry, he said. Third, Fernandez noted that even the diaconate for men is underdeveloped, with many dioceses in the world not having any deacons at all, and many of those that do treating it only as a step towards priesthood. As an aside, the Synod, as we'll talk about here in a moment, has criticized the permanent diaconate as being glorified altar boys, and that's actually not exactly wrong. Anyway, statistics confirm the point. According to the Vatican data, 97% of the roughly 48,000 permanent deacons in the world, meaning men who are usually married and not preparing for the priesthood, are in North America and Europe. These few examples make us understand that hurrying the request the ordination of deaconesses is not the most important response to promote women, Fernandez said. Defending his dicastery's focus on ways women can exercise authority in the church without ordination, Fernandez said that reality is superior to ideas. The interest, he said, is in the leadership roles women have played, not because they were imposed on communities or as the result of a study, but because women have acquired this authority under the impulse of the Spirit and facing a real need of the people. I am convinced that we can move forward step by step and arrive at very concrete things so that we may understand that there's nothing in the nature of a woman that prevents women from occupying very important positions for the leadership of churches, Fernandez said. That which truly comes from the Holy Spirit cannot be stopped, he said. End quote. Now, there's a lot here. I spend probably the entire live stream talking about just that quote. I do wonder how the things he's advocating here square with what St. Paul said about women teaching in churches. One of the most infamous quotes in all of the Bible. Atheists like to hurl it at us. They like to hurl it especially at women online who are engaging in apologetics. I wonder how he would square with that. You might not be familiar even with what I'm talking about here. And there's a reason for that, because we are always told in the ordinary form that you get a lot more scripture than in a traditional mass. That's actually not even true. It isn't. But that particular passage from, I believe, one of the letters to Timothy has actually been taken out of your lectionary, meaning it's never on the schedule in your 3-year cycle. It never shows up. It might be one of the optional things, but I've never heard of a priest reading that at the ordinary form masses. But it's there. Go read St. Paul's letters, which you should be doing anyway. And you will know what I'm talking about. But in general, St. Paul would say, just invoking that letter to Timothy, that everything that Cardinal Fernandez said there is not allowed. None of it. The catechist stuff, what some of these other suggestions you're going to hear, including the request that preaching the gospel, meaning the reading of the gospel at the Mass, which is reserved at present to priests and to permanent deacons, or transitional deacons, meaning the men on their way to the priesthood, that it's limited to them and them alone, that be opened up, as well as homilies. And that directly conflicts with Scripture. I mean, it just does. You can't get around that. But as you might expect, what Cardinal Fernandez says here, the proponents of deaconates haven't taken this well, to put it mildly. See, Fernandez didn't show up to their big meeting because he had other things to do. People were outraged by that, and that wasn't enough to satisfy them, especially when he said, oh, we'll hold another meeting. Well, that wasn't enough. So now the bishops who are their allies are speaking out in defense of what they want, despite Francis and Fernandez saying no repeatedly. They have even said the very survival of the church in their countries, and more broadly, the universal church itself, depends on the ordination of deaconesses. Because if you understand the law of gradualism, when it comes to what heretics do, deaconesses are, as people have pointed out in my comment sections on any video or live stream I do on this, that this all began with girl altar boys and communion in the hand. And that is absolutely true. That's how you got to where you are now. And they won't stop at deaconesses. They won't. So we go to katholisch.de to bring to you the words of wisdom, if you want to call them that, of a figure from the German bishops that we pretty consistently bring up in our live streams here. And of course, Bishop Botzing is involved. The headline is katholisch.de. Discussions would no longer be sufficient. World Synod. Botzing advocates for women's diaconate. Of course he has. He's done this many times. He's the head of the German Bishops' Conference. If you're not aware, the Germans had their parallel synod going on that they then submitted as their result for their participation as the Synod on Synodality, but theirs was called the German Synodal Way. And they wanted to have ordained deaconesses, the reading of the gospel. They wanted to have laity running parishes, laity having essentially a veto over who gets to be a bishop, laity having a veto over who gets to be a seminarian, laity having a veto over who gets ordained a priest. That's what he wanted. He also wanted the church's teachings changed on the James Martin stuff and all the rest of it. A good pope would have excommunicated him already, or would have declared that he had earned an automatic excommunication for all the stuff he advocates, and would have then declared his see vacant and filled his see with somebody who was actually Catholic. But we don't live in times like that. Instead, we have him, Bishop Botzing, who, that is a bishop. He doesn't look like a bishop, does he? He's not wearing the garb of a bishop. I don't even see a pectoral cross there. He looks actually like a businessman or a Protestant minister or something else, but he doesn't look like a Catholic bishop. Here's his argument. From katholisch.de, the official news arm of the German bishops. Here is his argument. Quote, The chairman of the German Bishops' Conference, Georg Botzing, is committed to making it easier for women to access the ordained diaconate. According to a transcript of his non-public speech, which is available to the EPD, Botzing told Synod participants on Thursday, quote, "We have spoken a lot in recent days about the need to involve women in the leadership of church communities at all levels and in the process of consultation and decision-making in a better way than before. But this is not enough." The exchange at the Synod showed that the question of admitting women to the sacramental diaconate is not only being asked in a small part of the world church. For the cultural area I come from, an answer to this question will determine whether women will continue to seek and find their home in the church, warned the Limburg bishop. Meaning women will walk away from Catholicism, as if they weren't doing that anyway. In the last week of the Synod, there will be another meeting on Thursday, next week, well, this week, meaning tomorrow, between Synod participants and the Vatican's authority on faith. This was announced by its head, Cardinal Victor Fernandez, in Rome. Members of his authority form the working group that Pope Francis set up to deal with the issue of women. This meant that the issue had actually been removed from the Synod's agenda, but since the Synod began on October 2nd, the issue has played an important role for many. The 368 voting participants of the 16th Ordinary General Assembly of the Synod of Bishops are meeting in Rome until October 27th. Among them are also lay people, including 45 women. Pope Francis ushered in the World Synod in autumn 2021. Since then, the structure and direction of the Catholic Church have been discussed. At the end of the Synod, concrete resolutions and recommendations to the Pope are to be formulated. And then it goes on to not tell you that the Synod doesn't end here. Next year, the working groups keep meeting and issue reports themselves. And then Francis will probably give us a document synthesizing all of that and responding to it probably in the summer, because that's generally the schedule for this. And I would not be surprised in the slightest if Francis next year, or even by Christmas, announces yet another General Synod meeting of the bishops in Rome for next year. It wouldn't surprise me. This thing was supposed to be done a year ago, but it keeps going. It is actually the entire process from the first meetings at your parish level until now has lasted longer than Vatican II has. Synod without end. But this all shows this entire thing is really kind of funny, because he wasn't the only one becoming melodramatic about this, because that's what this is. This is melodrama. The very survival of the church is at stake, right? So we get this. Michael Haynes, the LifeSite news reporter, posted this on X. I'm presuming he's been there himself, and I'll go deeper into what the statement is in a moment. He says, quote, "One day after Cardinal Fernandez said that issue of female deacons, quote, not mature," meaning it could change in the future, Germany's Bishop Overbeck, again another German, tells press, quote, "We must provide new answer for role of women in the church. We haven't found answers to lack of priests, and unless we change, we will no longer have priests in parishes." Okay. The elephant in the room is that the post-conciliar era has been a disaster for the church. That's the elephant in the room. And all this talk about not having priests in parishes unless you get priestesses and deaconettes, the elephant in the room is that the post-conciliar era has been an absolute disaster for the church, with a general apostasy happening and being facilitated by the same kinds of bishops and by every single person who sat on the throne of Peter from 1958 to today, to some degree or another, either by turning a blind eye to things going on or giving in to modernist demands. That's how you got communion in the hand and other things. Becoming more secular and more Protestant won't take care of the problem. The solution the modernists are giving here is akin to dumping gasoline on a fire in an attempt to put it out. This is going to make things worse, not better. See, the exchange that led to that quote is worth giving more attention to, because his statement, that bishop's statement, was in response to a reporter asking about it. And so we could turn here to Matt Gaspers, who he has posted the entire exchange. He transcribed it by hand and put the whole thing on X, and this is worth going into. Well, here he says, Vatican journalist Diane Montagna asked two important questions during today's Holy See press conference. One, after noting the fiducia supplicans, approval for blessing James Martin pairings, was issued after last year's assembly without the approval of Synod delegates, she asked Archbishop Andrew Fuyanya Why should the Catholic faithful who seek to remain faithful to the Church's teaching have any trust that these more controversial topics, meaning the ordination of female deacons, which Pope Francis removed from general discussion and gave to special study groups, will not be handled in the same way? Meaning, the Synod might be talking about it, but Francis might just make a unilateral decision like he did with Fiducia Supplicans. In response, the Archbishop said the current synodal process, quote, must continue, and that, quote, the controversial topics that have been given to the small groups are being handled in a synodal way. 2, she asked Bishop Overbeck to clarify his prior comments about women preaching, noting that, quote, preaching is tied to holy orders. Thus, quote, in what scenario could you imagine a woman preaching, given that this has never been part of the Church's tradition? Bishop Overbeck answered in Italian. According to the real-time translator, he said it, quote, depends on what you mean by preaching and its quality, noting that in his diocese there are, quote, very few priests, and thus, quote, there are some services in which the only guidance is provided by women, and they also preach. Earlier in the same press conference, he said, we must provide a new answer concerning the role of women in the Church. So far, we have not found an answer to the lack of priests. Unless we change, we will no longer have priests in our parishes, and this is going to happen relatively soon. Get back to Matt Gaspers here in a moment because he gives you some canon law about why this can't happen. Unless, of course, that news about the changes to the Code of Canon Law that I reported a couple days ago involve this, and I think it will. But there is an elephant in the room here. Have the bishops and priests start teaching the traditional Catholic faith. Mandate your Novus Ordo Masses be reverent. Have traditional altar boys, we'll say, and that's it, at the altar with the priest. Maybe the permanent deacon, of course, too. Unleash the traditional Mass so it can be available anywhere in the diocese, as long as you have priests to offer it. Preach the traditional faith from the altar. Uphold traditional Catholic morality. And you will see your vocation start to increase. That's the track record of history. Yeah, the people who are essentially sacramental secularists won't like it much, but you will get your vocations. It just takes time. That's the option. And they won't even consider it. I guarantee you this has never even occurred to them. Back to Matt Gasper saying, regarding lay preaching, the current 1983 Code of Canon Law states, Canon 766, lay persons can be permitted to preach in a church or oratory if necessity requires it in certain circumstances, or it seems advantageous in particular cases, according to the prescripts of the Conference of Bishops and without prejudice to Canon 767, subsection 1, which we'll get to in a moment. By the way, you know that extraordinary ministers of Holy Communion, that's the laity giving Holy Communion, that's supposed to be done under extraordinary circumstances very similar to this. They're not supposed to be an everyday thing at your parish. They're supposed to be there when your bishop can't do it, or your bishop or priest who's presiding over the Mass can't actually do it himself. He doesn't have enough help to do it. And it's been demonstrated that communion kneeling on the tongue at an altar rail is faster than communion in the hand. It's supposed to be rare. It's not supposed to be normal. Hence why that office is called Extraordinary Minister of Holy Communion. Emphasis on the word extraordinary, meaning extraordinary. This is treated in the way that should be treated. It's rare. I don't think I've ever seen laity preaching at a Mass before. But the Church does make provision for it. Here's this caveat, though. Quote, among the forms of preaching, the homily, which is part of the liturgy itself and is reserved to priest or deacon, is preeminent. In the homily, the mysteries of faith and the norms of Christian life are to be explained from the sacred text during the course of the liturgical year. With Vatican clarification, preaching in churches or oratories by the non-ordained faithful can be permitted only as a supply for sacred ministers or for those particular reasons foreseen by the universal law of the Church or by conferences of bishops. It cannot, however, be regarded as an ordinary occurrence, nor as an authentic promotion of the laity. This is where canon law is likely to change things. And then the previous Code of Canon Law had things to say about this too, not particularly relevant to the discussion at hand. But this all shows something fundamental about the Synod. The biggest proponents of the Synod are upset that what looked promising for them on the deaconesses front is ending with waffling from Rome by saying that the issue isn't mature yet, meaning it can change in the future. in some way. Now, an Italian journalist described it in this kind of way on X, and I found it kind of humorous in general. His name is Matteo Mazzuzzi. He says, begun with bishops rushing to ordain deaconesses, the Synod on Synodality ends with squabbles and reprisals over male deacons who become ordained altar boys. The spirit truly blows where it wants. And the critique that permanent deacons are glorified altar boys is not without merit. Again, its data says most of them exist in Western Europe and North America. And most bishops and most priests don't really know what to do with them. Some of the reading I've done on this is in our time, it is demonstrable that most of the permanent deacons don't do one of the things they were meant to do, which is to run the finance committees of your parish. Why were they meant to do that? Because in ancient times, the permanent deacons in ancient times safeguarded the material treasures of the church. That was one of their jobs. It wasn't the priest's job, it was the permanent deacon. Doesn't happen anymore. Know that from experience from sitting on parish councils. And to compound all this, the Synod ends on the 27th and is followed immediately by a spiritual reflection. This is going to be an angry meeting when it happens, and it'll be very interesting to report on it the next day. Here is the press release from the Vatican outlining what's going to happen here. This is celebrating the anniversary of Lumen Gentium. Again, I've never heard of a council being celebrated, its anniversaries being celebrated after the fact, except for Vatican II for some reason. But this is the official announcement. From the council to the Synod, rereading a church's journey, 60 years on since the Lumen Gentium, to take place the 28th to the 30th of October 2024 at the Pontifical Gregorian University. Now, they're going to be reflecting on the Synod at this the day after the Synod starts, while people are still very angry about the lack of deaconettes, because they felt like they were promised deaconettes, and they're not getting them, at least for now. Who knows what a future pope will do? And I got a prophecy video for you that I'm putting together for next week on just that topic. So who knows? But here is the announcement for this absurdity. Quote, in the aftermath of the closing of the second session of the Synod Assembly from the 28th to the 30th of October 2024, renowned theological experts and canonists will gather for 3 days at the Pontifical Gregorian University to accompany the new synodal step. Organized in collaboration by the General Secretariat of the Synod and the Collegium Maximum of the Pontifical Gregorian University, the International Conference, From the Council to the Synod, rereading a church's journey 60 years after Lumen Gentium, constitutes in fact the first act of theological reflection after the closure of the second session of the Synod Assembly. Paul VI, opening the second session of the Second Vatican Council, asked, "Church, what do you say about yourself?" He echoed the question of the assembly of the Synod of Bishops. "Church, what have you heard about yourself?" The title chosen for the International Congress, From the Council to the Synod, tells the story of the Church's journey, which the Congress intends to reread, taking the circularity between the Synod and the Council as a criterion for interpretation, rereading the Synod in light of the Council and the Council in light of the Synod. The 60 years of the Church's journey are a challenge to understand the complexity of the reception process and the question of whether what the Church is experiencing with the Synod process is really the mature fruit of the Council and its ecclesiological proposals. Speakers will include Cardinal Mario Gresh, Secretary General of the Synod, Cardinal Jean-Claude Hollerich, General Rapporteur of the Synod, the Reverend Giuseppe Bonfrate, Delegate President of the Synod, etc., etc., etc. Each day will end with a summary of the work entrusted to doctoral students. That sounds like a terrible idea to me. It also sounds like navel gazing. Reading Vatican II in light of synodality is a great way to reframe Vatican II, and I'm not a defender of Vatican II, but that sounds like a great way to reframe it, to make it mean whatever you want it to mean, and then reframing synodality in light of this new rereading of Vatican II, and on it goes. Very circular reasoning. The potential for it is there. All while happening days after the Synod closes and people are still upset they didn't get their deaconesses and whatever else modernist nonsense they wanted. This is just tone deaf, and I find it absolutely funny. Now, in a related note, There is something that the Synod of Synodality did not address. Since it's basically over now, why didn't the Synod of Synodality address the quality of the men who are in the priesthood now? If you read the things that they had to say, watch the press conferences, all the reporting on it, all of it, they were very concerned about the lack of priests, the lack of permanent deacons, all of it. They were very concerned about these things. Why did they not address the quality of the men in the priesthood? If they were trying to, as many of them said, advocating for these changes to Catholicism, this rethinking of the sacraments and things, they were concerned about the legacy of Ted McCarrick, basically, and all of his spiritual children, those men morally unfit to be priests in the priesthood of Jesus Christ. They were very concerned with them, and for good reason. We should all be concerned with them. We should be concerned with Francis's weird habit of keeping bishops who hid men like that in his orbit, his own weird, disturbing, honestly, habit of reinstating priests or attempting to who did these things. Father Marco Rupnik comes to mind immediately. We should be concerned with that. We should be concerned that the Synod didn't bother to take that up in any meaningful way. The German bishops, in their synodal way, tried to package this concern as their motivation for giving laity control of who can be bishops, giving laity control over who could be seminarians, giving laity control of who can be ordained priests, giving laity control of parishes. They packaged that way. Their call for deaconates and eventually priestesses, and by some of their own admissions, female bishops. They packaged it all of that in light of the men like McCarrick. We should be concerned with those men because they're still there, or men with at least a James Martin inclination. And when you look at the parallel between them, it's a perfect correlation in the data on the men who did McCarrick type things and the men with James Martin inclinations. The Synod won't touch that with a 10-foot pole because the Synod was about adopting the logic of secularism in the church to address these moral questions, essentially a tacit admission that the secular world is right and the Catholic Church has always been wrong. It's a fundamental attack on magisterial authority, and I doubt we're done hearing about synodality anytime soon. And unfortunately, we can actually take notes from Protestants for once on this, because we have this report from the Aquila report that talks about the Presbyterian Church in America being proactive in ways the Catholic Church, for whatever reason, refuses to. So we get the headline from the Aquila report. The Constitution of the Presbyterian Church in America prohibits the ordination of men who experience unnatural inclinations. The Presbyterian Church in America recently adopted changes to its Book of Church Order that specify that an elder, quote, should conform to the biblical requirements of chastity and purity, and mostly, quote. That's logical. That's Christianity 101. I would add to that an elder, or in our case, a presbyter, a priest, should conform and submit to the church's teachings on everything, but especially on purity, on morality, and should never even give hint that he disagrees with them. The Synod could have done that. They could have also taken up the issue of expelling men from clerical orders who violate that, and would have gone much further to taking care of this McCarrick problem than they think deaconettes are going to. But unfortunately, they are so in love with deaconesses and the logic of secular philosophies underlying all of it that they think that's going to solve the church's problems, and it won't. Living according to the law of God, living a prayerful life, will go much further to solving this problem than anything these people do. I hate to give non-Catholic organizations credit where it's due, but the Presbyterians deserve credit here for this. They do. Even if I will not ever endorse their theology in any way, shape, or form. But here's what they did. In light of the secular world pressuring them, like they do the Catholic Church, to adopt secular values on all things. Quote, The Presbyterian Church in America recently adopted changes to its Book of Church Order that specify that an elder, quote, should conform to the biblical requirement of chastity and purity in his descriptions of himself and in his convictions, character, and conduct. Similarly, deacons are to be conspicuous for conforming to the biblical requirements of chastity and purity in their descriptions of themselves and in their convictions, character, and conduct. It may be fairly asked what this means, as the phrases chastity and purity occur nowhere else in their book. To understand the terms, we are therefore compelled to consider their use in the other elements of our Constitution, the Westminster Confession, and larger and shorter catechisms. In considering this, it is helpful to consider the original overture from Mississippi Valley Presbytery that urged the modification of stuff from their books. In its whereas statements, the book plainly states the preservation of chastity in body, mind, affections, words, and behavior in oneself is an indispensable duty and qualification for office. See 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2, and Titus chapter 1, verses 5 to 9. And that, quote, any expression of inclinations or intimacy that is not directed toward the fulfillment of a lifelong covenant of marriage, as described scripturally, is contrary to nature and to nature's God. In so doing, it cites larger catechism question, whatever, which says all unnatural inclinations are sins forbidden by the seventh commandment, as are all unclean imaginations, thoughts, purposes, and affections. The positive duty enjoined by said commandment is chastity in body, mind, affections, words, and behavior, meaning exactly what that subsection said in its whereas statement above. From this, we see that chaste and pure are matters of the heart and mind as well as the body, and that they are opposed not only to immoral deeds, but to the inclination that provokes such deeds, both in general and in the case of unclean, unnatural inclinations in particular. And mostly quote. Why do they get this and the Catholic leadership doesn't? Why do they get this? Now, the answer to that is, unfortunately, the Bella Dodd thesis. If you're familiar with School of Darkness, where she admitted that she, working on behalf of the hammer and sickle countries on the other side of the Great Divide in East and West in the Cold War, that she placed men morally unfit for the priesthood into the seminaries, something like 1,000 of them or something. And what kind of men would be morally unfit for the priesthood in the 1920s or 30s and 40s when she was doing this infernal work? By her own admission, there were men like James Martin. It was a two-pronged approach. It was that and men who held to the ideology of Karl Marx. That was the purpose. Why? To undermine the church's authority and to turn what authority it still had after that into the service of their cause. That was why. Now we live with the consequences and in the world made by them. There are some estimates. Up to 80% of your bishops are like James Martin. 80%. Maybe that's overblown. Maybe it's only 65. That's still about 65% too many. Okay. There should be none. Zero. They should be men of the utmost moral character. Maybe they are, or at least outwardly appearing. Maybe they go to confession with their confessors and they stay close to the sacraments to keep on the straight and narrow to be a good shepherd. But in general, there should be no appearance whatsoever of impropriety. None whatsoever. And the Presbyterians seem to get it. But Catholic leadership won't touch that with a 10-foot pole. If you want to talk about things that will truly undermine the faith of people, it's stuff like that. That groups who are having great success bringing people out of the Catholic Church into their erroneous ways. Presbyterians are making enormous inroads in South America and in Africa right now. And the bishops do nothing about it. And why? Because their men have the outward appearance of holiness. Have you ever noticed in life when you speak with somebody and you encounter somebody, you can generally tell if they are on a higher spiritual plane than you are? I have that all the time when I speak with certain priests. All the time. They are men I would trust implicitly. That effect, when you're talking about evangelization, keeping people in the church, cannot be understated. The Presbyterians seem to get this. And while there's a general apostasy going on in the Catholic Church, I don't think it's a we need to take stock ourselves, because the synod was embarrassing. Thankfully, for the most part, the secular world wasn't paying attention, nor were Protestant groups that much paying attention to what was going on. But it was embarrassing to watch, to watch these men not take the faith seriously, to violate Scripture overtly, to say that Scripture and magisterial authority of the church has always been wrong on these issues, instead of confronting the major issues undermining the church in our time. Let me know what you think of all this in the comments, please. Like, subscribe. If you haven't, it does help. So sharing this on social media helps too. We'll wrap this up here. So, as always, I tell you to pray for the church, because the church desperately needs your prayers in this time, as these people here are undermining the church's sacred authority. So please pray for the church, pray for Bishop Botzing, pray for all these influential figures who are undermining the church's authority on this issue. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.